The music of the 20th century holds an important place in the story of the evolution of music. It introduced so many ideas that we take for granted nowadays. For example, self-contained music collectives, i.e. bands, who control both the writing and playing of their music, the replacement of written-down sheet music with recording technology as a primary source of record, and just a few instruments, guitar, bass, keyboards, and drums, providing as much texture, color, and volume as an entire symphony orchestra did in the preceding 4 centuries. The slowly building achievements of the 15th century to the 19th century, compared with the rapid development of music within decades during the 20th century, is truly an astonishing contrast to observe. It's well established at this point that when one talks about the music of the 20th century and its most impactful artists, that conversation inevitably leads to the Beatles. Their impact and influence essentially functions as a center of gravity for all modern music, even up to this point. As a music school graduate, I can tell you, ask any professor, especially the songwriting and theory professors, and you will hardly hear anyone dispute the fact that, pound for pound, the Beatles reign supreme as the prima practica of modern music. But I want to propose an alternative history, if you will. There is, in my estimation, another band from Hawthorne, California that had a huge impact as well, and but not for a series of unfortunate events, would have become the premier music group of the 20th century. That band is of course the Beach Boys, and the album that would have done it, the never-released Smile. A brief obligatory introduction of both bands in case you are not familiar. The Beatles were a British rock group formed in the late 1950s in Liverpool, England, consisting of the members John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. They got their start as scrappy kids playing Elvis and Chuck Berry covers, before moving over to Germany, slugging it out in clubs in Hamburg, and then returning back to England, cleaning up their appearance, and writing a bunch of groundbreaking songs that changed culture irrevocably, and led to an epic shifting perception of what music could be, etc., you know the rest. And if you don't, there's a ton of great Beatles documentaries, too many to list, but I'll leave a few in the description. The Beach Boys were also a band formed in the late 1950s by a group of brothers, Carl, Dennis, and Brian from the Wilson family, along with their cousin Mike Love and childhood friends Al Jardine and David Marks. They initially put out their early records before the Beatles and specialized in a more stripped-down surf rock, some might even say pre-punk, style of music, in contrast to the British beat music of the Beatles. However, as they progressed, they expanded their sound to include doo-wop, vocal jazz, and R&B influences before ultimately releasing the world-changing Pet Sounds and then subsequently slipping into a series of dysfunctional album releases and touring, or rather non-touring, cycles before ultimately emerging in the late 1970s as a nostalgia act and riding out that appeal until current day. The Beatles throughout the 60s continued ascending the stairway of greatness to the hallowed halls of musical immortality, whereas the Beach Boys were great for a time before ultimately declining into irrelevance and boomer pastiche, and now are an embarrassing reminder of what could have been, and it's best if they are more or less not talked about. And that's how the story has gone up until this point. But as I said at the start of this, I want to explore an alternative view of history, one that looks very different to the version we currently experience now, hinging on what would have happened had Smile been released in 1967 instead of 2011, as it was in this timeline. However, before we do that, and don't worry, it's coming, it's important to look at the unique musical and sonic qualities that separated the Beatles and the Beach Boys from the outset, so we can better understand how they ended in the distinct musical destinations that they did. The first point we need to touch on when it comes to comparing the Beatles and the Beach Boys is their different methods of production. Firstly, to note in this department, the Beatles consistently throughout their career had an exterior person in George Martin who handled the production direction on their music to varying degrees. It could be small things from a mere suggestion on changing the form of a song, to bigger things like entirely rearranging, reharmonizing, and reorchestrating a piece. On the other hand, from the beginning, Brian Wilson was both musical and production leader of the Beach Boys. Even from their early garage days, Brian Wilson single-handedly directed production on everything, from choosing specific orchestrations to arranging songs. Brian Wilson did it all, and he did it all by himself. Now, in terms of the sound of the production of both the Beatles and the Beach Boys, it's important to note the differences. As mentioned previously, because George Martin was in control of the Beatles' production, and admittedly, they were not really knowledgeable about the technicality of recording, their production style, despite the rapidly changing artistic flourishes of their career, remained rather stable. That is, isolated recording of instruments and vocals with a relatively dry, typical 1960s approach. While some might scoff at the statement such as the Beatles' production style remained the same for the entirety of their career, it really is true. Though songs like an early banger such as Tell Me Why and later songs like Strawberry Fields are about as radically different as you can get, they are still ultimately recorded the same way. Just listen to how, as crazy as Strawberry Fields is, you can still hear the cellos isolated from the chimes, isolated from the vocals, isolated from the guitars and drums, and so on. It is a cacophony of sound for sure, but the approach is still essentially the same approach they would have taken to record 8 days a week. The situation was very different with the Beach Boys. While they too started with the standard isolation and separate miking of instruments, they quickly changed by the time of Little Deuce Coupe to heavily incorporate Phil Spector's Wall of Sound production technique. I won't get into the entirety of what the Wall of Sound and who Phil Spector was here, that deserves a separate video. But basically, to describe the Wall of Sound in contrast to the Beatles' recording technique, with traditional isolating and miking, you want to be able to hear each instrument as an individual aspect of a greater musical whole. With the Wall of Sound, the goal is to fuse all instruments playing into one amorphous whole that is lush and fully filled out, with no one instrument able to be determined from the next, hence the term Wall of Sound. With production differences defined, it's essential to now note the slight but yet very substantial differences in musical influences of both groups that would profoundly shape the differing approaches to psychedelia in Sgt. Pepper versus Smile. Firstly, the Beach Boys' influence of jazz vocal groups such as the Four Freshmen and the Four Aces were, and still are, eclectic influences for a rock band to have. And it is apparent even from the early records of both bands that this is a demarcating stylistic difference just based on how the vocals are arranged on each record. To put it plainly, the Beatles' vocal harmonies are simple and sweet, akin to the Everly Brothers, nothing too complicated or out of the norm for an early 60s rock group. Vocals were sung in 2 or 3 parts and often never differed from the basic triadic building of harmony for the voice. Meanwhile, the Beach Boys took vocal arrangement and manipulation in a wholly different direction, which brought a distinct and unique sound that even to this day is considered a rarity. While many Beach Boys songs contain typical rock and roll harmonic structures not unlike the Beatles or many other bands of that time, their vocal arranging style was modeled on the aforementioned jazz vocal groups like the Four Freshmen and the Four Aces. This meant that while the Beach Boys often conformed to standard rock harmonic structures, the vocals placed on top were rich, jazz-based 4 and 5 part style block chord harmonies that often featured polyphony and advanced chord substitution on top of simple Chuck Berry style rock and roll songs. If you just listen to the Beach Boys' early work, it can be easy to miss, but what they accomplished in the early part of the 1960s is kind of amazing when you look at it and consider how young they were when they did it. It's easy to see, starting with this unique approach, how it might influence more experimental works in a truly unique way. It's clearly established here that there are some pretty distinct differences between these two groups, and throughout the early to mid 1960s, each group continued to hone their unique skills in the field of rock and pop. The Beatles continued tightening up their songwriting and close, simple harmonies, and with the help of George Martin, began incorporating new and unique elements into their production. In addition, of their own accord, they really began to take off as songwriters and visionaries of their works. It's been said a million times, but there really is no way to quantify how important it was that the Beatles initiated the viewing of the album as a full body of work that should be composed cohesively, rather than a ragtag grouping of songs that may or may not be of similar quality and may or may not have anything to do with one another. The Beach Boys, despite the high quality of their musicality, did not quite take up this visionary approach at the same time as the Beatles, and Brian Wilson knew this. Upon hearing Rubber Soul, he knew a change was needed to keep the Beach Boys relevant. His response to Rubber Soul was the now immortal Pet Sounds. Now, I feel like I need to take a breath and go through this slowly and deliberately, because the breadth and depth of importance of Pet Sounds cannot be undercounted. And while this isn't exactly a video about Pet Sounds and its multifaceted innovations, it is important to note that its effects on form, texture, instrument choices, and recording techniques were unprecedented in almost every way in any genre at the time of its release. The release of Pet Sounds did not go unnoticed among the Beatles, and prompted them to push their creativity even farther, which resulted in the also important Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Like Pet Sounds, I am sure I do not need to go over the world-changing, epic-shifting nature of Sgt. Pepper, but needless to say, its effects on recording and the studio as an instrument were also unprecedented at this time. Now, this, my friends, is where the story usually ends. Pet Sounds is released and pushes the ball forward almost infinitely. Then, the Beatles come along and respond by releasing Sgt. Pepper's. For a brief moment, the two groups are seen as equals, but with the Beatles' further innovations with the White Album, Abbey Road, etc., they take the mantle as the true artists of their time, and the Beach Boys sputter and spin out, unable to cope with the successive majesty and achievement of the Beatles. This, my friends, is the story most of us know today, and continues to be perpetuated everywhere, from music academia, to conversations among friends, to active musicians, to among really everyone. However, today with this video, as I said before, I hope to, if not change your mind, offer an alternative perspective that has always been there, but due to the obscurity and dysfunctional nature of said perspective, it has remained hidden and not well known outside of a few obsessives such as myself. So as I said, the ping-ponging nature of the Beatles-Beach Boys relationships in the late 60s goes like this. Rubber Soul is released, then followed up by the Beach Boys with Pet Sound, and the Beatles then respond with Sgt. Pepper's. And that is what is mostly known, as I mentioned earlier. However, while the Beatles were working on Sgt. Pepper's, the Beach Boys were working on their follow-up to Pet Sounds, an album that to Brian Wilson was to be a collection of music that redefined the meaning of what modern music was to the world. This album, or project, was entitled Smile. Due to the subsequent obscure nature of Smile, it is tempting to think that at the time in the late 60s, the project would have also been a secretive creative process that would have been kept from the public until it was ready for release. But actually, this was not the case at all. In fact, all of us are more than likely familiar with a piece from Smile that was actually released and hit #1 on the Billboard charts in 1966. A full year before Sgt. Pepper was released. This song was Good Vibration. While Good Vibrations is well known among most people today, and especially musicians, I feel I really need to emphasize how amazing it was and how it showed the radical changes that were possible in contemporary studio music. It was referred to as a pocket symphony, a full year before Strawberry Fields, and if we explore the pseudo-sonata form-like structure of Good Vibrations, similar in many ways to God Only Knows, and look at the mixing of new instruments such as the theremin, organ, and guitar with old instruments such as the cello, we see the beginnings of a new idea of what constituted an orchestra that presaged innovations from late 20th century contemporary classical composers in many ways. When all of this was mixed together with Brian Wilson's modified wall of sound production, we start to get something that truly looks like it is pointing the way to a new style of music. Not rock and roll, not classical, not contemporary classical, but some strange amorphous new music that combined all the best elements of all these together. And it is clear this is not just my opinion in 2021. In 1966 and 67, many critics, based on both the commercial and artistic success of Good Vibrations, assumed that whatever the Beach Boys would release as their next long player, which was Smile, would change the world of music irrevocably and influence the direction of all future artists. And it is my contention that those critics were in fact right. Now, because of the effects of a series of events that occurred during the recording of Smile, it appears that this argument made at the time seems laughably wrong to some people today. Factor in the cringe-inducing turn that the Beach Boys have been prone to since the late 70s, and it becomes understandable. Nonetheless, I will heretofore press my case as to why, had these troubles not befallen the group in the late 60s, our world of music would be so different in so many ways. In order to make such a bold claim as I am that the entire world of music might have taken a different turn, we need to understand what it is about Smile that even to this day is so radically different, unique, and groundbreaking in its approach, especially compared to the contemporaneous work of the Beatles at the same time. Let's start first with this, its unique one-of-a-kind take on, quote, psychedelia, unquote. Already with Pet Sounds, it was clear to most people that the Beach Boys' take on trippy or psychedelic music was very different than most other musical artists of the time. Most artists of the 1960s considered psychedelia to be a series of distinct musical and production techniques. These included the use of Indian instruments in the context of traditional pop rock songwriting, the use of the studio as an instrument in very distinct ways, i.e. reverse echo, tape splicing, sound collages of found sound like spaceship noises layered on top of music, tape speed manipulation to produce twisted effects on vocals and instruments, early sampling, etc. And finally, lyrical content about going on a trip to the journey inside your mind, questioning the meaning of life, and in a more down-to-earth fashion, simply talking about drugs. It's important to note that all of this was done in the aforementioned isolated style of production, sectioning off instruments and vocals to achieve supreme separation of the musical elements. With those typical aspects laid out, it becomes clear upon inspection of Smile that the Beach Boys, and specifically Brian Wilson, had an entirely different take. On Smile, the distinctive Wilsonian take on psychedelia included an even more unique and refined version of his wall of sound technique, mixed with the incorporation of late 19th century Appalachian melodies and instruments, specifically heavy use of the dulcimer, banjo, and washtub bass. The revival of the ultra-obscure 1950s lounge genre of Exotica, pioneered by people like Martin Denny and Les Baxter, and peculiarly Eden Abe. I've made a separate video about Exotica that you should definitely check out if you want to learn more about that obscure genre. The reintroduction of obscure styles of vocal harmony, including 20th century barbershop quartet style singing, doo-wop harmony, and 16th century chromatic renaissance style of vocal harmony. A revisiting of harmonic and melodic ideas in the style of the Great American Songbook a la Cole Porter, use of Wagnerian leitmotifs to structure songs and sections of the album as opposed to set forms such as verse-chorus 32-bar AABA, orchestration based on strict classical techniques mixed with the aforementioned Appalachian instruments and current-day pop rock instruments such as guitar, bass, drums, etc. It's clear from these attributes that the experience of listening to Smile was going to be a wholly different affair than listening to any other psychedelic record of the time. Briefly here, I'd like to go over and highlight how some of these characteristics stick out in the course of listening to the album. First, let's listen here to one of the four centerpieces of the album, Heroes and Villains. This song, if you have not heard it, is a tour de force in unique and virtuosic vocal arrangement, orchestration, and the breaking of traditional forms in a contemporary setting of studio music. Verse-chorus is abandoned in favor of what appears to be an extended and slightly modified sonata rondo form. The song, as I mentioned, is just a glory to behold, and you should really listen to it over and over again to grasp its subtleties. One thing I want to highlight is how it plays the role of introducing what I will call the madness leitmotif, which subsequently appears throughout the course of the first quarter of the album. In the song Heroes and Villains itself, it appears as the B section of the aforementioned sonata rondo form. However, when viewed as I mentioned as a Wagnerian leitmotif, we can see its reappearance in the following track, Plymouth Rock. When listening, I cannot emphasize enough how genius, at least to me, it is to be able to incorporate and modify the idea of the Wagnerian leitmotif into a contemporary setting and successfully deploy it coherently. I've made a separate video on Richard Wagner and his innovations if you're interested in learning more about this. And let me emphasize, I know of no other record of studio-based music that has remotely tried to effect this technique of having a recurring passage appear over the course of multiple album tracks in an album. It was just so unprecedented and world-shattering, it amazes me to this day whenever I play the first 4 tracks of Smile, how it ends up dissolving into a connected Wagner-like passage out of Die Valkyrie. Again, I cannot emphasize enough how absolutely virtuosic and wholly individual of an approach this was among the Beach Boys' peers and ever since. And it is not limited to this moment. If we fast forward towards the end of the album, we see a similar leitmotivic approach taken between the songs Look, Child is the Father of Man, and Surf's Up. A theme which I will call the child motif is introduced in Look, expanded upon in Child is the Father of Man, which in some ways itself functions as a prelude and is then finally built upon and transformed in the seminal Surf's Up. Way, similar to the earlier use in Heroes and Villains, this section of the record collapses again into a Wagnerian endless melody concept unrelated to track listing and song running time. And on that note of the endless melody concept, I want to discuss what I view as the 4 pillars of Smile that I feel demarcate sections of the album and ultimately provide centers of gravity for the juxtaposed music around them. These are Heroes and Villains, Cabin Essence, Surf's Up, and Good Vibrations. While not all of these pieces contain the leitmotivic elements that I mentioned earlier, if one listens to the album, it is clear that these pieces serve as gravitational tent poles of progression, and often songs preceding and succeeding them are loosely connected either thematically, musically, or lyrically. And each of these tentpoles demonstrates the fullest realization of the previously mentioned ambitions and intentions of the album. One particular song I want to focus on is Cabin Essence, as I think it is the strongest example of the album's Appalachian wall of sound pseudo-psychedelia approach. The song features a prominent banjo figure with a bizarre doo-wop sounding vocal from the group. The song later veers into a section based on a heavy fuzz electric bass, double-tracked with washtub bass, and an almost unintelligible lyric sung in a polyphonic style with early 20th century classical harmony, which is indeed a lot. A couple of the other songs surrounding Cabin Essence contain a few of these aforementioned elements, but in my opinion, this song is the one that points the way to a whole new style of psychedelica. And the truth is, unlike some of the other unique things about Smile, this style here actually did manage to find its way into the mainstream by way of late 2000s indie rock. One could characterize quite a few Grizzly Bear tracks as sounding like they are cut from the same DNA as Cabin Essence.
Light the lamp and fire mellow, Cabin Essence timely hello. In this old house, I'm not alone.
Besides the 4 aforementioned pillars of the album, if we explore Smile in all its essence, the distinct musicality shines in many places. In addition to the psychedelic Appalachia, the Exotica influence towards the end of the album in pieces such as Wanna Be Around Workshop, Wind Chimes, and Holidays is explored and extrapolated fully. In case you aren't familiar with Exotica, it's usually an instrumental form of lounge music, i.e. no vocals. But here Brian Wilson subverts that by adding traditional pop rock vocals in wind chimes over an Exotica template, which of course once again results in the very distinct one-of-a-kind take on Psychedelia. And while I would never say I am done in terms of summing the musical content of Smile up, that could go on for a lifetime, I feel like I've touched on a few of the aspects of it that I think are groundbreaking in ways I have found nowhere else in contemporary studio-based music. It's worth going over again just how amazing some of the orchestration on the record is. Going back to the song Look, we get a style of orchestration that is almost entirely classical based with few nods to contemporary rock-based harmonic movement. In fact, Brian Wilson's style of orchestration was often favorably compared to that of Percy Grainger, an Australian composer from the early 20th century who often re-orchestrated classic ethnic European folk songs into grandiose works for the concert hall. There really is nothing else to say. Like Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, Wagner's Ring Cycle, Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, the Mass in B minor, Sgt. Pepper, Led Zeppelin 4, etc., etc., or any other great work, you need to listen to Smile once in your lifetime. Without a doubt in my mind, Smile's innovations are so unique and profound, they would have changed, or at the very least, significantly impacted the direction of popular music in the 20th century had the album been released in 1967. But it wasn't released in 1967. It wasn't even released in the 20th century. In 2011, my first year of college, the Smile Sessions came out and changed my entire world and outlook of what music was and what it could be. And it showed me there was so much undiscovered country left to be explored. While the impact it has had on the music I have made is profound, it was the release in 2011 that made me ponder how different music in the past could have been had this been released at its intended date, and what went wrong that prevented this incredibly seminal album from being released. As of making this video, it is currently May 2021, 10 years after I first discovered Smile, and also Mental Health Awareness Month. Now I want to be very careful about how I handle this next section of the video. I don't know Brian Wilson personally, so I do not want to probe and prod at his personal life during the recording of Smile, as he has gone on the record many times reluctantly, to speak about the personal pain and mental anguish he experienced during this period and the lingering negative after effects that period had on him. So to honor him, I want to speak more generally here about how scrutiny of public figures in the latter 20th century was many times of a vindictive and destructive nature, and how our past disregard as a society for mental health should help us learn to never repeat these mistakes again. Nowadays, celebrities have so many platforms to speak out and share their truth and their side of the story on any given situation directly, and respond to negative media hit pieces. Through the power of Twitter, they can directly stand up for themselves and their self-worth. Heck, even from 10 years ago, there has been so much change in the power of how social media can empower and help change our society for the better. Needless to say, this was not the case in the 20th century. Oftentimes, if celebrities were having personal struggles, the media was quick to lambast and humiliate without a second thought, or in the best case scenario, just be very invasive and provide unwanted scrutiny into their personal life and artistic work. There was no sense that these people, or really people in general, were entitled to self-respect or decency. And time and again, we saw many beloved figures in the arts struggle deeply with this relentless scrutiny. It would result oftentimes in increased substance use, periods of inactivity, or in the worst case scenario, the end of their existence. And it happened far too often to mention. Looking back now, we can see how morally reprehensible the media was at that time. Now, theoretically, if there was a sensitive genius who happened to be struggling with any sort of mental health issue in the late 1960s, the media would have launched scrutiny after declaration after speculation, and we would now see that as abusive and unfair. However, at the time, it would have continued unabated. And again, in retrospect, it is no surprise that this invasiveness would very likely derail an artist who was rendered fragile due to internal struggles in their personal life, especially if that artist did not have a supportive team of people around him to help him stabilize himself among such an onslaught. Which brings me to my second point about why Smile's world-changing impact was denied to us. Mike Love. Now listen, I probably will never get backstage passes to any current-day Beach Boys concert due to what I'm about to say, but screw it. Mike Love was, and is, a conservative, toxic male douchebag with no taste and a hatred for true art.
All you need to do is just wait for Bernie. He's going to give it all free, so then you'll be fine. So you don't have to worry about a thing.
Intense, I know, but I can confidently say having a toxic presence constantly around you, berating you, second-guessing you, and criticizing every move you make, while at the same time contributing almost nothing, will have a negative effect on a person, whether that person is struggling with mental illness or not. And as I said, despite Mike Love's brief dalliance with transcendental meditation, he was both musically and culturally during the 1960s a conservative pushing against the musical and cultural tides in a way that was in sharp contrast to basically every other artist of that era. Literally, this was a man who thought in 1968 that the right thing to do would be for the Beach Boys to return to a late 1950s, early 1960s surf rock sound to gain commercial success, which shows that not only was his artistic taste permanently off, but even his self-proclaimed commercial smarts were a joke as well. Every time Brian Wilson excitedly pushed the Beach Boys to explore the new terrain he was creating for them in his mind, Mike Love pushed back in a typical toxic male chud-like fashion, ranting about drug culture and how he didn't want to be associated with the hippies. Yes, a member of a popular 1960s rock group in his late 20s really said this. A few lyrics on Pet Sounds were reportedly even changed due to Mike Love's inference that there were references to drug culture on some of the songs. This constant battle was clearly a source of supreme dysfunction in the Beach Boys in the late 1960s. We can definitively say that Mike Love's constant close-minded pushback took a toll on Brian Wilson's self-confidence and undoubtedly contributed to the collapse of the Smile project. And it wasn't just Brian Wilson. Throughout the Smile recordings, it is well known that Brian Wilson was collaborating heavily with one Van Dyke Parks. Now, Van Dyke Parks really deserves his own video for how unique a life he lived in music, but basically, like Brian Wilson, he was a musical polymath of the highest comport, and he and Wilson ended up writing quite a few groundbreaking pieces of music together, including the aforementioned Heroes and Villains. And how do you think Mike Love took to that? Take a guess. Van Dyke Parks ended up leaving the Smile project as a collaborator, and I am sure it is in no small part due to Mike Love's constant berating of him, Brian Wilson, and the music they were making together. Now, as much as I am anti-Mike Love, I am old enough now to learn that the world is made up of shades of gray, and to blame the entirety of the collapse of the Smile album on him, or the media, or Brian Wilson's alleged struggles with mental health, trying to nail it down to one source is not the way to approach this situation. Life is complicated, messy, and chaotic, and nowhere more than in the world of the arts. However, it is important to note that all this aforementioned dysfunction that was going on in the Beach Boys was definitely not occurring in the world of the Beatles. While the Beatles surely had their share of dysfunction as well in this period, none of it would become crippling until the dawn of the 1970s. And surely none of it was inhibiting enough to stop them from recording, producing, and releasing an album. And that very reality forms the crux of much of our musical existence up until this point. Because the Beatles were able to successfully record, produce, and release material in this key moment in time, this is the linchpin that propelled them to the top of influence and adulation. The release of Sgt. Pepper's and the shelving of Smile is, in my opinion, the definitive moment of the music of the 20th century and its course throughout history. I want to end this video with a thought. Imagine a world in which Smile was in fact released in 1967. What would that world have looked like? What would Dark Side of the Moon or Bohemian Rhapsody sound like? Would the idea of a Wagnerian uber melody become an adopted concept for sections of albums? Would the Wall of Sound production style have survived, thrived, and ultimately outshone the more common, still to this day, isolation recording approach? These are all questions that I have meditated on and continue to fascinate me in just how different some of our favorite records might have sounded had Smile been released as intended. But the truth is, it wasn't released in 1967. It was released in 2011, and the world of music is as it is. So what are we to make of Smile, this seminal work that never was, but yet also was? I think it is important for all of us, musician or not, to ponder on the importance of self-determination in the face of opposition, and just how truly fragile we all have the potential to be when confronted with said situation. Smile could have been released. It could have. But it was not, due to these compounding factors bearing down on it. On a purely musical level, I think it is pertinent that we go back and rescue some of the obscure and fascinating ideas and concepts Brian Wilson was putting forward on this record. I know for my music, this record has been an essential part of my creative process. Smile is vital. Thankfully, we were in fact able to experience it after all, despite the delay. Revel in its radiance and absorb its light. And now I am going to end on a very weird note for some of you, but bear with me. As a student of mysticism, one of the key areas I've immersed myself in is the study of spiritual alchemy. The symbolism of transmuting lead into gold as a spiritual journey from flawed, damaged humans into refined spiritual beings is very important to me. When I listen to Smile, I see the perfect example of musical alchemy. As I listen, I can hear, feel, and see Brian Wilson's journey of spiritual transmutation into an actualized form in music. No matter where you are in life, musician or not, I hope that as you listen to this amazing record, you too will see this transmutation, this turning of lead into gold, as a metaphor and hopefully an inspiration in helping you along with whatever journey you're on in life. The Beach Boys' album Smile is, to me, the greatest album of the 20th century, and we should all be grateful to have it.